advice to you: don't buy cars that have been in accidents, especially if that car was involved in a fatal accident. Also, don't take any parts or spare pieces from a car that had an accident where people died and install them in another car. And don't buy a car that was involved in a fatal accident, even if it was repaired very well, and you feel happy about its cheap price, because you don't know that this happiness won't last. Also, don't rent or buy an apartment where a murder happened, or a fire that killed the people inside, or even a motorcycle that flipped over and its rider died. In short, so I don't make the introduction too long, stay away from anything connected to a brutal death incident, because the story I'm about to tell you now is connected to that idea. It's the story of the ghosts of Flight 401, and it's very difficult for anyone to deny it or call it a myth, because what happened had many witnesses who saw it with their own eyes, not one or two witnesses, but hundreds. So what is the story of Flight 401 that led to ghosts appearing on different flights? And how did the passengers of this flight turn into ghosts that appeared to people? What were these ghosts doing, and what did they look like? Watch the video until the end to learn the full story, and don't forget to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you receive new videos as soon as they are uploaded to the channel. At around 8:30 p.m. on terms of size, it was incredibly massive. The aircraft could accommodate 400 passengers. At that time, ordinary planes had 4 seats across in each row, but the L-1011 model had 8 seats across in a single row. The plane was also divided into 2 levels. The first level was the main passenger cabin, and the second level was located in the rear section below. You could reach the lower level through 2 elevators, and each elevator was very small, barely enough for one person. These elevators took you down to the aircraft's galley, which was very large and spacious, filled with ovens and refrigerators. After the galley, there was another room designed as a lounge specifically for the crew, so they could rest there if they wanted. The captain of this flight was named Bob Loft. He was 55 years old and had more than 30,000 hours of flight experience. He was known as one of the most excellent pilots in his field. After Captain Bob boarded the aircraft and made his way to the cockpit, he sat in the main front seat on the left. Sitting to his right was the co-pilot, 10 years younger than him, named Bert Stockstill, who took the right seat designated for the co-pilot. In normal aircraft, the cockpit usually had only 2 seats, one for the captain and one for the co-pilot. But in the L-1011 model, the cockpit was very large and had 4 seats. In addition to the captain and co-pilot, a third person joined them, the flight engineer named Don Repo, who was 51 years old. A few seconds later, the fourth person arrived, named Angelo Donadeo, who was 47 years old. Angelo didn't really have any specific job on the plane. He was simply an employee of Eastern Airlines who needed to get to Miami that night, so the company placed him on Flight 401 to travel with them. At 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks were completed, all passengers were seated, and the crew was fully prepared. 10 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., the aircraft took off, and Flight 401 was now flying in the skies of New York City, heading south toward Miami. During the next 2 hours, the flight was very normal, calm, and pleasant. In fact, one of the passengers, named Jerry Scow, took out a piece of paper and wrote a letter praising the airline. In his message, he wrote how happy he was with Eastern Airlines and how smooth and comfortable the flight was, and that he didn't feel any fatigue at all. He planned to mail this letter to Eastern Airlines after arriving in Miami. But at 11:32 p.m., 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, this calm and pleasant flight would suddenly take a very bad turn. At that time, Captain Bob was approaching Miami International Airport and could already see the runway from a distance. He began preparing the landing gear to land. However, a problem appeared when he attempted to lower the landing gear. The aircraft had 3 landing gear groups, one under the right wing, one under the left wing, and the third at the front under the cockpit. Each group had a green indicator light in the cockpit. If the right landing gear lowered correctly, the green light for the right gear would illuminate. The same applied to the left gear and the nose gear. When the captain lowered the landing gear, 2 indicator lights illuminated, the right and left gear, but the nose gear indicator light did not turn on at all. That meant the nose gear might not have lowered. The captain and the 3 crew members thought the problem might only be with the indicator light itself, not the landing gear, especially since the aircraft was new and fully inspected before takeoff. To confirm this, the captain raised the landing gear again, then lowered it once more, hoping all 3 lights would illuminate, but the problem remained the same. The captain contacted Miami Air Traffic Control and informed them about the landing gear issue. The control tower instructed him to move away from the runway and circle over an area called the Everglades, which was a large swampy lake area with shallow water and muddy ground. The captain activated the autopilot and set it to circle at 600 meters above the lake while they tried to fix the nose gear problem. The captain first thought the indicator light itself was faulty, so he tapped it with his fingers, but it didn't light up. He then removed the panel controlling the landing system to check for any broken wires or stuck gears, but found nothing. After reinstalling it, the light still didn't work. Feeling frustrated, Captain Bob asked flight engineer Don Repo to go down through a hatch in the cockpit floor known as the hellhole. This hatch led to a compartment beneath the cockpit containing equipment and wiring. There was also a small viewing window, like a peephole, through which he could see the front landing gear and confirm whether it had deployed. Don Repo went down to check the nose gear. Meanwhile, below the aircraft, in the large lake, there was a man named Robert Marquis fishing for frogs with his friend in an airboat. The lake was extremely dark, with no buildings, lights, or people nearby for miles. Suddenly, they saw a massive yellow light appear about 5 miles away, illuminating a large portion of the lake like a flash, then disappearing instantly. Robert asked his friend what that was. His friend said he didn't know and suggested they go check it out. They started the airboat and headed quickly toward the source of the light. After 15 minutes, traveling at 65 kilometers per hour, they couldn't believe what they were seeing in front of their eyes. Let's go back 20 minutes to the moment when Captain Bob looked back at the flight engineer and told him to go down through the hellhole and check whether the nose landing gear had deployed or not. While the captain was turning around to speak to the flight engineer, he accidentally bumped the control yoke with his leg without noticing. That small bump was enough to disengage the autopilot. As a result, the aircraft was programmed into a gradual descent. However, no one in the cockpit noticed that the plane was descending. The area over the lake they were flying above was extremely dark. There was no full moon lighting the area, no nearby buildings with lights, and no visible reference points for the captain, just darkness. Also, the descent wasn't sudden, it was slow and gradual, so the captain didn't notice that the plane was losing altitude. He believed the aircraft was still flying in its programmed circular path using autopilot. Another factor was that everyone in the cockpit was busy trying to fix the malfunctioning nose gear indicator light. Shortly after the flight engineer went down into the hellhole, the captain and the other 2 crew members suddenly heard a warning alarm indicating that the plane was dangerously close to the ground. By the time the captain realized what was happening and tried to pull the aircraft up, it was too late. The plane crashed into the ground with all the passengers on board. Upon impact, it exploded. That explosion was the same flash of light that Robert Marquis, the frog hunter, and his companions saw from the lake. When they reached the crash site with their airboat, they were shocked by the sight of the passengers. Some were screaming, some were crying, some were groaning in pain, some were already dead, and others were taking their last breaths. Fortunately, the plane crashed into soft, muddy ground. The explosion created intense fire, but the moisture and water in the ground quickly extinguished the flames, preventing them from spreading across the wreckage. If the plane had crashed on solid ground, it would have been completely destroyed and burned. Also, since the aircraft descended gradually rather than hitting nose first at high speed, the crash wasn't as violent as many other plane crashes. For these reasons, some passengers survived, while others died. Robert Marquis and his friend tried to help the survivors and pull them out of the wreckage. After 30 minutes, civil defense and rescue teams arrived at the crash site. Helicopters transported the injured to hospitals throughout the night until dawn. By sunrise the next day, there were no additional survivors. In this accident, 99 people died and 77 survived. Among the dead were Captain Bob Loft, co-pilot Bert Stockstill, and flight engineer Don Repo, who had gone down to check the nose gear. The 4th employee with them, Angelo Donadeo, survived the crash. Jerry Scow, the passenger who had written a letter praising the flight, also survived. After the investigation, authorities concluded that the crash was caused by human error. It turned out that the nose landing gear had actually deployed correctly, and the real problem was that the indicator light for the nose gear had burned out and stopped working. Following the investigation, the airline promised to pay compensation to the injured and to the families of the victims. They also pledged to change their pilot training system completely to prevent such disasters from happening again. But this wasn't the end of the story of Flight 401. It was only the beginning. 3 years after the accident, hundreds of employees at Eastern Airlines began experiencing strange and frightening phenomena. Many of them reported these experiences to their supervisors, but the company warned employees not to talk about these incidents. Any employee who spoke about them was either given sick leave and sent to a psychiatrist or dismissed from their job entirely. Despite the intense pressure from the company to keep quiet, some brave employees shared their terrifying experiences with journalists and media outlets. However, they did not reveal their real identities, so the names mentioned are pseudonyms. In March 1973, 3 months after the Flight 401 crash, Eastern Airlines assigned a flight attendant named Jenny to serve on Flight 318 from New York to Florida. Another flight attendant named Denise was also on the same flight. Jenny and Denise were close friends, and neither of them had ever worked on Flight 401. However, Flight 318 used the same aircraft model, the L1011. In fact, some parts recovered from the wreckage of Flight 401 that were still intact had been installed into other aircraft, including Flight 318. Investigators had discovered that many components remained undamaged and could be reused. After testing, they were approved for installation in other aircraft of the same model. Since the aircraft model was very expensive and the crashed plane was still new, the airline reused those parts to reduce costs. Also, those components were not the cause of the crash. The main cause was human error by Captain Bob. Jenny and Denise, along with other flight attendants, divided their duties to serve about 200 passengers. 5 attendants worked on the main level, taking orders, while the rest worked in the lower galley preparing food and drinks. At one point, Denise was on the main level taking many orders and felt overwhelmed. She decided to go down to Jenny in the lower galley for help. At the same time, Jenny decided to go up to check if Denise needed assistance. They used separate elevators at the same time and didn't see each other. When Jenny reached the main level, she asked about Denise. They told her Denise had just gone down to the galley. 2 minutes later, Jenny took the elevator down to look for her. To understand what happened next, you need to know the layout of the lower level. When you exit the elevator, you face the galley. Ovens are on the left, cabinets on the right, and at the far end is a wall separating the galley from a lounge. The lounge entrance is on the right side at the end, and you can't see inside unless you step through the doorway. When Jenny arrived, the galley was empty, and the lounge door was closed. Jenny suddenly felt strongly that Denise was inside the lounge. Confident in that feeling, she didn't knock or check. She started heating food and preparing trays, expecting Denise to come out at any moment. 2 minutes passed. No one came out. Jenny began to wonder if Denise was playing a prank, hiding inside to scare her. Jenny grew increasingly nervous. After several minutes, no one appeared. The longer she stayed alone, the stronger the feeling became that she wasn't alone. Terrified, Jenny slowly walked toward the lounge door. Her heart was pounding. She opened the door and quickly looked inside, but no one was there. Still, the feeling remained that someone was with her. She checked behind chairs and sofas, hoping to find Denise hiding, but the lounge was completely empty. Overcome with fear, she backed out slowly, keeping her back against the wall to avoid being surprised from behind. She finally reached the galley, still empty, then rushed to the elevator, repeatedly pressing the button in panic while constantly looking behind her, convinced someone was following her. Finally, the elevator arrived. She rushed inside, closed the door, and went back up. When she stepped out, she accidentally bumped into another flight attendant named Meredith. Meredith turned around and saw Jenny pale, sweating heavily, and looking terrified, like someone who had died and come back to life. Meredith asked her, "Are you okay? What happened to you?" Jenny, struggling to speak, replied, I can't explain what just happened." Meredith kept asking Jenny questions, trying to understand what had happened to her. Finally, she said, Come with me, Jenny. Meredith took Jenny to an empty space behind the elevators, where Jenny saw Denise. Denise's face was pale like the dead. She was sweating and trembling. What had happened was the following. During the time when Jenny first went up to look for Denise and learned that Denise wasn't upstairs, she went back down again. In those few minutes when Jenny was upstairs, Denise had already gone down to the lower level. Denise said that when she went down, she found the galley empty, but she had a strong feeling that Jenny was still down there with her and that she wasn't alone. The same scenario happened to her. She opened the lounge door expecting to find Jenny inside, but when she didn't find anyone, she panicked, quickly closed the door, ran back to the galley, took the elevator, and went upstairs. At that exact same moment, Jenny was coming down in the other elevator. This meant the two attendants never saw each other during those minutes, and neither of them met the other on the lower level. Yet both of them felt someone else was with them, and neither of them felt alone. This was the first time both attendants experienced something terrifying like this, but it turned out this situation repeated with other flight attendants in the same lower galley and lounge area on Flight 318. Of course, if any of them complained to the company, no one would believe them. They would be accused of harming the company's reputation, fired, or labeled as mentally unstable. But these weren't the only frightening events that occurred on Flight 318. There were even more terrifying stories. 1 month later, on the same aircraft, Flight 318 was at New York Liberty International Airport preparing for a flight to Miami. After inspections were completed, passengers boarded the plane. A flight attendant named Sis counted the passengers and discovered there was one extra passenger beyond the expected count. She reviewed the list again and discovered the extra passenger was sitting in first class. From his uniform, he appeared to be an Eastern Airlines captain. The attendant assumed he was deadheading, meaning a pilot traveling as a passenger to another airport where he was scheduled to fly. In the 1970s, airline security procedures were not strict like today, and such situations were common. Still, she needed to record his information. The captain sat motionless, like a statue, wearing his cap pulled down, hiding his face. Sis asked him, "Sir, are you deadheading?" He didn't respond or move. She asked again, louder, "Sir, what's your name so I can register you?" Still, no reaction. Another flight attendant named Diane noticed Sis struggling and came over. She also tried speaking to him, but he remained completely still. The two attendants exchanged confused looks. Sis then said, "I'll go get the captain." She went to the cockpit and returned with Captain George. Meanwhile, several nearby passengers noticed the situation and watched closely. Captain George knelt beside the seat to see the man's face under the cap. The moment he saw it, he fell backward in shock and shouted, "That's impossible! That's Captain Bob Loft, the same captain who died in Flight 401. George had known Captain Bob personally before his death and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Before anyone could react, right in front of Captain George, the two attendants, and 6 passengers watching, Captain Bob suddenly vanished into thin air. Passengers began screaming in terror. The attendants broke down crying in shock. Despite their fear, they tried calming the passengers to prevent panic from spreading across the aircraft. Captain George and the crew searched the entire plane, unable to accept that someone could simply disappear. They asked all passengers to remain seated for an hour while the crew searched thoroughly, but they found no trace of him. Eventually, after the delay, Captain George returned to the cockpit and flew the plane to Miami. Captain George, Diane, and Sis filed a report about the incident, but Eastern Airlines ignored the report and filed it away. Within 2 weeks, rumors spread among employees, and many wanted to read the report. Later, when employees asked for it, they were told no such report existed. However, some pilots had already read it before it disappeared and described it as extremely terrifying. Over the next 2 years, many employees reported similar paranormal sightings, especially on L1011 aircraft that had parts taken from Flight 401. Some reported seeing silent figures sitting like Captain Bob's ghost. One company manager saw the captain's ghost fade away from a seat during routine inspection and fled the aircraft in terror. Another incident involved a catering employee placing meals in the lower galley. He entered the lounge to rest briefly and saw a man sitting silently in uniform. The employee later described him as resembling flight engineer Don Repo, who died in Flight 4 401. When he tried to speak to him, the figure vanished. Another incident occurred in Flight 318's cockpit. A pilot heard knocking from the hellhole below. He went down to inspect, but found nothing. As he climbed back up, he saw the ghost of Don Repo standing below. Then it vanished. In another flight, a female passenger began screaming hysterically after seeing a man suddenly appear in the empty seat beside her, then disappear again. She remained in shock throughout the flight and had to be restrained and taken off the plane by paramedics in Arizona. But not all encounters ended in fear. One incident reportedly saved lives. A captain entered the cockpit before dawn and saw Don Repo's ghost, who warned him of a serious engine problem. The captain checked and found the fault exactly as described, preventing a possible disaster. Finally, in 1974, the paranormal events suddenly stopped. Eastern Airlines dismissed all reports as rumors. However, that same year, during maintenance, the airline quietly removed all parts taken from Flight 401 from L1011 aircraft, despite those parts functioning properly, and replaced them with new components. After those parts were removed, all paranormal events stopped completely, and here ends the story of the ghosts of Flight 401. But don't forget, if you liked this story, like and share the video with your friends. The most famous street in the most famous city in the world is Fifth Avenue in New York City. This street is home to some of the world's most famous wealthy people and influential figures, all living side by side. It also contains some of the most famous museums, luxury stores, and fine restaurants. On this street, there is a small public park, but most people who live there have no idea that before this park existed, there was once a mansion standing on that spot. Something absolutely horrific happened inside that mansion. So horrific that the government or city authorities eventually erased the mansion from the face of the earth. What was this mansion, and what happened inside it? Stay until the end of the video to find out. Shortly after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out through the front door of a brownstone mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City. The man's name was Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, an engineer, a highly talented pianist, and a very wealthy man. Despite all that, he dressed very simply and never wore the kind of clothes people would associate with the rich. Anyone who saw him would never guess he was wealthy. That night, Langley quietly left the mansion while trying not to be seen. He walked a long distance toward the Brooklyn Bridge to get something for his older brother, who was bedridden on the second floor of the mansion. The night was freezing cold. Langley pulled up the collar of his jacket around his neck, partly because of the cold and partly to hide his face from both the police and the neighbors. He kept his face concealed until he reached the area beneath the Brooklyn Bridge, where he began searching through garbage containers for something he wanted. Eventually, he found it. He placed it inside a sack, threw it over his shoulder, and headed back to the mansion. A few days later, on March 21st, the telephone rang at the police station nearest to the Collier brothers' residence. The officer answered and asked the caller for his name. The caller said his name was Charles Smith. The officer asked, "What's your report?" In a rough voice, the caller replied, "There's a dead body inside the Collier brothers' mansion." Although this was a serious report, the New York City police no longer paid much attention to reports involving that mansion because most of them turned out to be nothing more than rumors. People in the neighborhood believed strange and suspicious things were happening there. One of the brothers living in the mansion would often sneak out after midnight, fill a sack with items collected from garbage piles, and return home. Nobody knew what he was bringing back. Another strange thing was that the mansion was completely isolated from the outside world. No one knew what was happening inside. Every window had been covered with metal sheets or wooden boards, making the place appear mysterious and unsettling. Because of this, whenever the neighbors heard any rumor about the mansion, they immediately called the police. The police would investigate, find nothing, and leave. This happened so often that the officers eventually grew tired of it. So when the officer received the call from a man named Charles claiming there was a dead body in the mansion, he asked, "How do you know there's a dead body in that mansion?" But the caller never answered. He simply hung up. The officer didn't want to waste resources by sending a full investigation team, especially since the report could easily be another false alarm. Instead, he assigned another officer to check it out and said, "Listen, If you find yourself with some free time, stop by that mansion and see if there's any truth to this dead body report. The following day, the second officer actually had nothing to do, so he decided to investigate. He got into his car and drove to the mansion. Even though people called it a mansion, it looked absolutely terrible. As I mentioned, all the windows were boarded up with metal and wood. The glass behind them was shattered, and newspapers had been stuffed into the broken openings. The front of the mansion was piled high with junk, wooden crates, and scrap materials. It looked more like a garbage dump than a mansion. When the officer arrived and saw the place, he could hardly believe that anyone actually lived there. But the Collier family had never been ordinary people. The father of the two brothers was a physician who collected real human body parts and stored them in glass jars filled with preserving chemicals. He kept these jars throughout the house. He was an extremely eccentric man. He would often leave the house carrying a small boat on his shoulder, walk all the way to the river while dressed in elegant doctor's clothing, and then return home carrying the boat on his shoulder again. Their mother eventually threw their father out of the house because he had practically turned the mansion into a hospital or sanitarium for tuberculosis patients. The two brothers grew up surrounded by this unusual environment and inherited much of their family's eccentric nature. Despite that, they were both highly successful. The older brother, Homer, was a genius. At just 14 years old, he was accepted to study law at Columbia University. His younger brother, Langley, who was 5 years younger, earned outstanding qualifications in both engineering and chemistry. He wasn't just a successful scientist and engineer, he was also a gifted musician and pianist who performed at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. Yet despite all of these accomplishments, neither brother ever married. After their parents died, they became even more isolated inside their mansion. Then, in 1933, 14 years before the officer visited the mansion to investigate the report of a dead body, Homer suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. At the time, he was 55 years old and at the peak of his legal career, but the stroke forced him to leave his profession. His brother Langley, who had become successful and well-known through his piano performances, gave up everything to stay home and take care of Homer. From that point on, the two brothers stayed inside the house almost all the time and rarely ever went out. They also stopped paying any of their bills, electricity, water, and telephone. As a result, all utilities were disconnected due to non-payment. Instead of paying the bills to restore the services, Langley bought a used car engine and converted it into a power generator for the house. On top of that, they were behind on their mortgage payments as well. One day, the police came to the mansion because of the debts they owed. Langley opened the door, spoke with them briefly, then wrote a check for the full amount, handed it to the officer, and slammed the door in his face. Now let's return to March 21st, 1947. The officer got out of his car and stood there staring at the strange mansion before walking through the gate. He climbed over piles of junk and scrap until he finally reached the front door. He knocked and knocked, but nobody answered. He pressed his ear against the door, trying to hear if anyone was inside, but he heard nothing. Since he had been sent to verify whether there was actually a dead body inside and whether the report was real or just another rumor, he needed to get inside and see for himself. So, he decided to force the front door open. But before breaking it down, he thought to himself, "Let me knock one last time." He knocked again, then a third time, then a fourth. Still no answer. He called out to the homeowners several times, but there was no response whatsoever. Finally, he said to himself, "Well, I've got no choice." He slammed his shoulder into the door. The door opened, but only slightly, about 10 centimeters. He tried squeezing through the opening and pushing the door farther. With great difficulty, he managed to get his head inside and take a look. The moment he looked in, he saw an enormous wall of junk piled up directly behind the door. At that moment, he understood why the door wouldn't open. Then suddenly, he smelled a horrible stench, a smell very much like something dead. Unable to tolerate it, he quickly pulled his head back and said, "No, no, no, I can't deal with this place by myself. God knows whether there's really a body in there or not, but this mountain of junk and that awful smell definitely means something isn't right." A short while later, 7 more officers arrived at the mansion. Together, they tried pushing the door open, but it was impossible to move it any farther because of the massive pile of junk and garbage behind it. So they said, "No, we're going to need a ladder and try getting in through a window." They brought a ladder, and one of the officers climbed up, broke one of the windows, and managed to enter. The others followed him inside, and that was when they discovered that the report had been true. There really was a dead body inside the house. The body they found on the second floor belonged to the older brother, Homer. They found him dead in a chair, wearing an old, worn-out bathrobe, with his head slumped forward almost to his knees. The floor around him was covered with large amounts of orange peels. They took the body to the medical examiner, and after examining it, he concluded that Homer had died approximately 10 hours earlier. So Homer was dead, but where was his younger brother, Langley? His brother was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had completely vanished. The police searched for him, but they couldn't find a single trace. They began to suspect that he might have killed his brother and fled, or at the very least had something to do with his death. They also suspected that he was the one who had called the police using a fake name, claiming to be Charles Smith. Perhaps he had reported the body and then escaped from the mansion. The police stationed guards at the mansion's entrance, hoping he might return at any moment so they could question him. They also issued a regional alert in neighboring states, stating that Langley Collier was wanted for questioning in connection with his brother's death. After searching everywhere and finding no sign of him, the police decided, let's search the mansion itself. Maybe we'll find some clue that explains what happened. Then, on April 8, 1947, 18 days after Homer's body had been discovered, the police finally found the evidence that solved the entire mystery. On March 21st, when the officer had first arrived and forced the door with his shoulder, he couldn't open it fully. That was because a complete wall of junk had been stacked behind the front door. The junk had been arranged in such a way that it seemed whoever piled it there did not want anyone opening the door. There were chairs tangled together with beds, a sewing machine, and enormous amounts of scrap, garbage, and miscellaneous clutter. The pile stretched from the front door deep into the ground floor. And it wasn't just the ground floor. The second, third, and fourth floors were also filled from floor to ceiling with junk. Among the items discovered inside the mansion were 14 broken pianos, an X-ray machine, and 25,000 books. There were also the glass jars their father had kept, containing preserved human body parts. An unbelievable amount of clutter filled the mansion. It appeared that over the years, the two brothers had collected all of these items and considered them their true treasure. They blocked the doors with them and covered the windows with metal and wood because they were convinced that neighbors, police officers, or anyone else might break in and steal their wealth. And besides all that junk, the police actually found money, jewelry, and other valuable possessions, but it was obvious that the brothers did not consider the money and jewelry to be their real treasure. To them, the true treasure was the junk they had gathered from the streets and garbage containers of New York City over the years, and they were extremely protective of it. That was why they had fortified the mansion so heavily. Amid all that clutter, there was also a complicated network of tunnels and narrow passageways, almost like a maze. Some of those passageways even functioned like traps. If a stranger entered without knowing the layout, entire piles of junk could collapse on top of them and bury them alive. That was why the police were extremely careful while searching the mansion. Eventually, they found the clue that explained how Homer had died. On the night of March 9th, 1947, the same night Langley left the mansion and headed toward the Brooklyn Bridge, he wasn't actually going out to look for more junk. He was actually looking for something specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges. Near the Brooklyn Bridge, there was a fruit store, and whenever fruit was about to spoil or rot, they would throw it away. Langley would collect those spoiled oranges from the trash and bring them back to his brother, because Homer had lost his eyesight after suffering the stroke. Langley had been searching through his father's old medical books for any treatment that might restore his brother's vision. In one of those books, he found information claiming that eating large amounts of oranges could help with the condition. So for weeks, he would go to the bridge, collect discarded oranges, and bring them home to his brother. Eventually, Homer came to rely on those oranges as a major part of his diet, and Langley became convinced that they were the cure that would restore his brother's sight. On the final night, March 9th, when he returned from the bridge carrying the oranges, he made his way through the narrow passageways and tunnels that wound through the piles of junk. The space was extremely tight, but Langley was thin and frail, allowing him to squeeze through. Eventually, he reached the second floor, and that was where the most dangerous part of his journey began. He had to crawl through a narrow tunnel between the piles of clutter, only about half a meter wide, in order to reach his brother at the far end of the second floor. The tunnel was filled with traps. If he stepped on the wrong thing or accidentally bumped into something, the piles of junk could come crashing down on him. One of those traps involved a very heavy metal box filled with old newspapers. Of course, this wasn't the first time Langley had traveled through that tunnel to bring something to his brother. He had passed through it hundreds of times and knew exactly which spots were dangerous and which objects he needed to avoid. But on that particular night, luck was not on his side. As he moved through the tunnel, he accidentally struck the metal box with his head. The box fell onto him, along with a massive amount of clutter, burying him inside the tunnel. The box was certainly heavy, but not heavy enough to kill a man instantly. However, Langley became trapped beneath the debris. It is likely that he spent hours screaming and calling out to his older brother, who was only about 3 meters away, begging for help. But Homer was blind and seriously ill. He had no strength whatsoever to get up. After all, he had been living for weeks on little more than spoiled oranges. Imagine the condition his health must have been in. There was no way he could rise from his chair and rescue his brother. It is likely that Langley continued shouting for hours beneath the debris, waiting for someone, anyone, to save him. But his brother was completely unable to help. Eventually, the weight of the box and the junk piled on top of him crushed him to death. And of course, none of the neighbors knew what was happening inside the mansion, so nobody came to rescue him. As for Homer, he remained seated where he was, slowly dying from hunger and thirst. It is possible that he could even hear the rats gnawing at his brother's body beneath the piles of junk. The piece of evidence that finally solved the entire case was a bone from Langley's leg, sticking out from the debris about 3 meters away from the spot where Homer's body had been found. Naturally, the police hadn't noticed the bone at first because of the enormous amount of clutter filling the mansion. But after 18 days of searching, they finally realized that Langley had been inside the mansion the entire time, buried beneath the debris without anyone knowing. This also proved that the person who called the police and identified himself as Charles Smith was not Langley, because Langley was already dead when the call was made. To this day, nobody knows who that caller was or how he knew there were bodies inside the mansion. Did he happen to pass by and smell something foul? Did he know something about the place? Or did he discover the truth in some other way? Nobody knows. But after the police discovered the bodies of both brothers inside the mansion, and since neither of them had any heirs, the mansion was demolished completely. It was considered a dangerous structure and a hazard to the surrounding area. Today, a public park stands in its place. It was named Collier Brothers Park, and all that remains there are a few trees and a single bench. And with that, our story comes to an end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and share it from all of your social media accounts. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. The story I'm about to tell is one of those true stories that didn't just cause an uproar in Russia, it shook the entire world. On the morning of Saturday, August 12, 2000, 33 Russian naval vessels were operating in the Barents Sea. The Barents Sea lies between northwestern Russia and northeastern Norway, extending toward areas near the Arctic Ocean. On that day, all 33 Russian naval vessels were taking part in a massive military exercise. These exercises were essentially war simulations. For example, one ship would pretend to be an enemy vessel, while the others would surround it and begin firing at it. Of course, no live ammunition or real missiles were used during these drills. Everything was training ammunition, blanks that produced sound and simulated combat without causing actual damage. At 9 a.m. that morning, the man in charge of the entire operation was Admiral Popov. Admiral Popov was aboard one of the vessels participating in the exercise. He issued orders to one of the submarines to launch dummy torpedoes at a simulated enemy target. That target was actually one of the other ships participating in the training exercise. The following morning, exactly 24 hours after the drills began, Admiral Popov was speaking on the phone with a Russian journalist. During the conversation, he proudly stated that the military exercise had been a complete success and had achieved all of its objectives. He continued praising the operation and the professionalism of the forces involved. But there was a problem. While Admiral Popov was giving reporters glowing comments about the success of the exercise, one of the families of the sailors participating in the operation received troubling news, or rather, a rumor, that something serious had happened to one of the naval units where their relative was serving. The family had no clear information and no details about what exactly had happened. All they knew was that something had gone wrong, so they started calling the families of other sailors and asking, "Our son serves alongside your son in the Navy. We've heard some bad news. Do you know anything?" The other families became worried as well. One family called another, then another, and soon everyone was trying to gather information. But nobody had any confirmed news about their loved ones, so they tried reassuring each other, telling themselves it was probably just a rumor. After all, if something serious had really happened, the authorities would surely contact them. But despite their words, they were deeply worried about their sons. Wanting to know the truth, they called the naval base responsible for the 33 submarines and ships that had participated in the exercise. But the clerk, or soldier, working at the information desk, found the phones in his office ringing non-stop. He answered calls from worried families and kept telling them, "Don't worry, they're fine. Everything you've heard is just a rumor. I haven't received any reports of any problems during the exercise." He continued trying to calm them down, but the families kept pressing him with more questions. As the calls became more intense, he slightly changed his response and said, "I've heard those rumors too, just like you. It's possible that something happened. Any military exercise can experience problems, but I haven't received any official report from command saying that anything went wrong." One of the sailor's relatives kept pressing him for more information, hoping to learn something he wasn't being told. But the employee suddenly raised his voice on the phone and said, "Sir, I've already told you everything I know, and I can't give you any more information than that." Then he hung up. When the sailors' families realized that calling the naval base wasn't getting them anywhere, they decided to turn to the media. They started contacting newspapers, magazines, and television stations. As soon as journalists learned about the story, reporters tried to reach Admiral Popov on the morning of Sunday, August 13th. They wanted to ask him, was what the sailors' families were saying actually true, or was it just a rumor? But Admiral Popov did not respond to them and ignored their inquiries. So neither the families nor the media knew the truth. All they could do was wait until the military exercise ended, hoping that the truth would finally come out. As the saying goes, today's news costs money, tomorrow it's free. On Monday, August 14th, after 48 hours had passed since the exercise began, people expected new information to emerge. Surely, they thought, government officials would appear on television and deny the rumors if nothing had happened. But instead, Russian officials announced that they had indeed encountered a technical problem involving one of their naval vessels. The vessel was the submarine Kursk. The Kursk was one of the 33 naval units participating in the exercise. In fact, it was one of the most important ones. Russian officials stated that the technical problem had caused the submarine to remain on the seabed. However, they assured the public that such incidents could happen and that there was no reason for alarm. They added, "We are in contact with the sailors through radio communications. Don't worry about them. They're all safe." They also claimed that efforts were underway to supply the submarine with air and power, and that it would not be long before the crew was safely brought back to the surface. They repeatedly emphasized that there was nothing to worry about. Naturally, these statements hit the sailors' families like a thunderbolt. Despite all the reassurances and comforting words from officials, the families were not convinced. They did not fully trust the official statements. The only thing that would truly reassure them was seeing their loved ones with their own eyes. At the same time, however, they still had hope. They knew that the submarine carrying their sons was no ordinary submarine. The K-141 Kursk was considered the pride of the Russian Navy. It was a nuclear-powered submarine, meaning it operated using nuclear energy rather than conventional diesel fuel. Inside the vessel was a nuclear reactor responsible for powering its systems. This allowed it to remain at sea for extremely long periods without needing to refuel, unlike traditional submarines. That was one of the reasons the Kursk was regarded as a highly advanced and exceptionally safe vessel by the Russian Navy. Quite literally, it was one of the finest submarines in the entire Russian fleet. The Russian Navy spared no expense when it came to the Kursk. It was enormous, incredibly expensive, and built to the highest standards. The submarine measured approximately 154 meters in length, roughly the size of 1.5 football fields. It was constructed from extremely strong and durable steel. The design was intended to withstand powerful impacts, and even if it came under direct attack, it was expected to continue carrying out its mission. In addition, it was equipped with some of the most advanced technology available at the time. So, if you were a Russian sailor or officer serving aboard the Kursk and something went wrong while the submarine was resting on the ocean floor, you would probably feel far safer than sailors serving on ordinary submarines. Then, 2 more days passed. Russian officials continued appearing on news broadcasts, telling the public, "Don't worry, don't panic, it's a minor issue, and it will be resolved soon." But despite all those assurances, the Kursk remained on the seabed. No one had been able to bring it back to the surface, and neither the sailors' families nor the media had any real information about the fate of the crew trapped inside. As a result, fear and anxiety continued to grow. The media began asking difficult questions. Was it really just a technical problem that was preventing the Russian government from rescuing the sailors, or was there something much bigger being hidden from the public? The answer to that question did not emerge until August 21st, 9 days after the crisis had begun. On that day, a Norwegian rescue team joined the operation alongside the Russian authorities. Norwegian divers successfully reached the submarine's emergency escape hatch. Some of you may be wondering, how can a submarine have an escape hatch or emergency door? Wouldn't opening it allow water to flood the entire submarine? The escape hatch, simply put, is a special chamber inside the submarine that contains 2 doors, an outer door and an inner door. The rescue team first opens the outer door, allowing the chamber to fill with water. However, the water cannot enter the submarine itself because the inner door remains sealed. Once the rescuers enter the chamber, they close the outer door. The water is then pumped out of the chamber, after which they open the inner door and gain access to the submarine to rescue anyone still inside. And on that day, the Norwegian rescue team finally managed to enter the Kursk. But what they found inside shocked them. It shocked the entire world. And what happened aboard the Kursk remains a topic of discussion around the globe to this day. Some people claimed the submarine had been attacked by a NATO ship or submarine. Others believed it had been attacked by a giant sea monster, and some even suggested that extraterrestrial beings living deep beneath the ocean had attacked it. But today, I'm going to tell you the version of the story that most of the world considers the closest to the truth. The Kursk submarine was divided into 9 compartments, starting with compartment number 1 at the front, then compartment number 2, then compartment number 3, and so on until the last compartment, number 9. And to understand what happened in compartment number 9, we first need to get to know one of the Kursk crew members. There was a 27-year-old officer named Dmitry Kolesnikov. Dmitry was born into a family where both his father and grandfather had served as submarine officers in the Navy. His lifelong dream was to serve aboard submarines just like his father and grandfather. And in the late 1990s, that dream finally came true when he was commissioned as an officer in the Russian Navy. He was assigned to serve aboard the submarine Kursk. 4 months before the military exercise, Dmitry had married a schoolteacher named Olga. Shortly after their wedding, he took her on a tour inside the Kursk and recorded a video with her as a keepsake. In the footage, Dmitry appeared extremely happy and excited. He explained what his work was like inside the cramped submarine and seemed proud to share this part of his life with his new wife. Now let's go back to the day of the exercise, August 12th, 2000. Dmitry was aboard the Kursk along with 117 other crew members. At 11:27 a.m., the commander of the Kursk informed Admiral Popov via radio that the submarine was fully prepared to launch its dummy torpedoes as part of the exercise. Admiral Popov was monitoring the exercise from aboard a warship. At that moment, the Kursk's commander had gathered all the torpedoes, both live and training torpedoes, in the forward compartment number 1. Meanwhile, Dmitry was on his way to compartment number 7, which housed the engine room. He was responsible for everything that happened inside that compartment. At the same time, sailors in the front section were replacing the live torpedoes with training torpedoes. Then suddenly, Dmitry and the sailors with him heard a tremendous explosion. At that same instant, they felt a violent shock that shook the entire submarine. Then, the submarine lurched backward with great force, as if some massive power had struck it from the front. Neither Dmitry nor the men with him had any idea what had happened. But what had actually occurred was that one of the live torpedoes in the front section had malfunctioned and exploded. However, because of the strength of the steel from which the Kursk was built, the explosion did not immediately breach the submarine's outer hull. Instead, it ignited a massive fire in the forward section. At that moment, Dmitry and the sailors with him had been thrown to the floor. They noticed that all the emergency alarms throughout the submarine had activated. Everyone was confused and asking, "What happened?" Dmitry then took charge of the situation. He ordered the sailors with him to follow emergency procedures. The first step was to seal the watertight doors in their compartment. The sailors in compartment number 7 immediately closed the door connecting them to compartment number 6. Then, they sealed the door leading to compartment number 8. By doing so, they were protecting themselves from flooding in case water entered the submarine. After sealing the doors, they began smelling smoke coming through the ventilation ducts. The fire at the front of the submarine was completely out of control. Suddenly, they felt the submarine tilt upward at a very steep angle. At that moment, the submarine commander was desperately trying to bring the vessel to the surface. But before the submarine could reach the surface, the flames reached the live torpedoes stored in the front section. A chain of devastating explosions followed. Those consecutive explosions killed nearly everyone in the forward part of the submarine. The victims died in one of two ways. Either they were completely burned by the intense fires caused by the exploding torpedoes, or the explosions tore holes in the submarine's hull, allowing seawater to rush in and drown them. Either way, it was a horrifying death. The men who survived the first explosion and the chain of explosions that followed were the sailors located from compartment number 6 through compartment number 9. The second series of explosions threw Dmitry and the sailors around him violently in every direction inside compartment number 7. Yet, despite everything, they were still alive, and they fully understood the terrifying situation they were now trapped in. Imagine Dmitry and the men around him desperately trying to hold on to anything they could so they wouldn't be injured. One man gripping a pipe, another hanging onto a ventilation duct, another shielding his head so it wouldn't smash into something. And after the second series of explosions, instead of continuing upward, the submarine began plunging downward at an almost vertical angle because its control and command center had been destroyed. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after the first explosion, the bow of the Kursk struck the seabed at a depth of 108 meters, 354 feet. Moments later, the stern of the submarine slammed into the bottom as well. No one knows exactly what happened to the sailors who survived during their first hours on the seafloor. All we know is that the submarine still had power, so the lights were working, and the air purification systems were still running. Despite the smoke filled with toxic chemicals, breathing was still somewhat possible during the first few hours. One detail that was later confirmed is that Dmitry and the men with him heard knocking on the door of their compartment coming from compartment number 6. That meant there were still survivors from the forward sections of the submarine. As a result, Dmitry was forced to break emergency protocol. He ordered his men to open the door, separating them from compartment number 6. The moment they opened it, seawater rushed toward them with tremendous force. The water carried the bodies of their fellow sailors who had died in the initial explosions. But among the bodies were still living survivors, the same people who had been knocking on the door. Dmitry and his men managed to rescue the survivors from compartment number 6. However, because of the force of the incoming water, they were forced to retreat into compartment number 8. After that, they all moved into compartment number 9. Although they sealed every watertight door behind them, it no longer made much difference. The submarine's walls had been riddled with cracks from the explosions and shrapnel. The hull had essentially become like a sieve. Water began leaking through every crack and hole in the metal. Dmitri and the others fully understood what was happening. Once they had all gathered inside compartment number 9, there was nowhere left to retreat. They had only two options: either wait for rescue from outside or attempt to escape through the emergency escape hatch. But trying to use the escape hatch at that depth was practically suicide. They were trapped in freezing water more than 100 meters below the surface. Without specialized diving equipment, they would die from hypothermia, and if the cold didn't kill them, the water pressure might. So Dmitri sat quietly, thinking carefully about what to do. There were 22 surviving sailors with him. He took out a sheet of paper and wrote the date and time at the top. Then he began recording everything that had happened. He wrote that an explosion had occurred. He believed that he and the 22 sailors with him were the only survivors. He wrote that they were trapped inside compartment number 9, and that there was nothing left for them to do except wait for rescue. He also noted that they had considered using the escape hatch, but they had concluded that it was not a realistic option. After writing the note neatly and clearly, he folded the paper. He placed it inside a waterproof envelope. Then he put it into his pocket. About an hour and a half later, the electrical power in compartment number 9 failed. They were left sitting in complete darkness, total blackness. No one could see anything anymore. As the power disappeared, the temperature began to drop steadily, and perhaps the worst part of the entire situation was that they could constantly hear water leaking into the compartment. Dmitri and the others knew exactly what that meant. It was only a matter of time. Soon the compartment would be completely flooded, and there would be nowhere left to go. As the water level continued to rise inside compartment number 9, Dmitri took the paper out of his pocket once again. He began writing a second note beneath the first one, but this time his handwriting was shaky and difficult to read, partly because he was trembling from the cold, and partly because he was writing in complete darkness. The final words he wrote stated that he was in a very dark place, and that he did not believe he would survive. In the last remaining blank space on the paper, he wrote a farewell message to his wife and family. He ended it with the words, "Best regards to everyone. There is no need for despair." Signed, Dmitri Kolesnikov. After writing those words, he placed the paper back into his pocket. Then he sat in the darkness, listening to the sound of water dripping through the walls, alongside the other 22 sailors, all of them preparing for the worst. No one knows exactly how long Dmitri and the other 22 sailors remained alive, but experts believe that the Kursk became completely flooded approximately 8 hours after the first explosion. The truly heartbreaking part of this story is that Dmitri and the 22 men with him might have been rescued if the Russian authorities had acted more quickly from the beginning. After Admiral Popov received the message that the Kursk was ready to launch its training torpedoes, the explosions occurred almost immediately afterward. Every vessel participating in the exercise felt the shock waves. In fact, the explosions were so powerful that seismic monitoring stations in Norway recorded them. Communication between Admiral Popov and the Kursk's commander was then lost, but Popov assumed it was merely a communications malfunction. He stated that the sailors were safe, and the situation was not treated with the urgency it required. When the Russian Navy finally realized that the submarine had sunk, they launched several rescue attempts, but they failed to reach the trapped sailors, partly because the rescue equipment available at the time was limited. Meanwhile, Norway, Britain, and the United States offered rescue assistance. However, the Russian government initially rejected all of those offers. They insisted that they were capable of rescuing the sailors themselves. Only after 9 days had passed since the sinking of the Kursk, and after every Russian rescue attempt had failed, did they finally agree to accept foreign assistance. That is why, when the Norwegian rescue team arrived with its advanced equipment, they were able to enter the submarine through the escape hatch, but they found the entire submarine flooded. The bodies of sailors were everywhere. Eventually, they discovered Dmitri's body, and inside his pocket, they found the note he had written. Naturally, the families of the sailors were furious with how the government had handled the disaster. A catastrophe of that magnitude should have been addressed far more quickly. Instead, the reports were initially dismissed as rumors, and once the true scale of the disaster became clear, rescue operations had already been delayed. Foreign assistance had also been rejected during a critical period when many lives might still have been saved. Many family members believed that their sons still had a chance to survive, but that chance was lost because of the delay. In an attempt to ease public anger, the Russian government awarded medals for bravery to the sailors who died. Their families received financial support for several years. They were also offered free housing in any Russian city of their choice. In addition, their children were granted free education through university. This story will show you that we may not be the only ones living in this universe, or even in this world. There may be other beings that we know nothing about. They could be coming from other planets, or they may have been living with us on Earth for thousands of years, but we simply don't know where they are. These civilizations could be living deep inside the Earth, or in the depths of the oceans, but all the evidence suggests that they are far more advanced than us in science and technology, and that, to them, we might be considered primitive. They may even be conducting experiments on us, just like humans conduct experiments on mice and animals. The true story I'm about to tell is one of those cases. Listen to it and decide for yourself. Do you believe in the existence of such beings or not? And please write your reason in the comments. Now, let's begin our story. On the afternoon of June 6, 1980, a 56-year-old man named Zygmunt Adamski was having dinner with his wife and his cousin in his red brick home in the village of Tingley, England. It had been a very exhausting day for Zygmunt and his family, because the next day was his daughter's wedding. Zygmunt loved his daughter very much, and she was deeply attached to her father. Zygmunt and his wife were unable to have children due to health issues, but he had adopted a daughter whom he loved dearly. He was very excited about her wedding day, but also very nervous. As you know, one of the most important moments for any father at his daughter's wedding is walking her down the church aisle and handing her over to the groom. Zygmunt was anxious about that moment, afraid he might make a mistake or become confused in front of the guests and embarrass himself, so he kept mentally preparing and rehearsing for that moment. That day, Zygmunt had also argued with his cousin after his cousin spoke disrespectfully to his daughter. Zygmunt confronted him and defended his daughter strongly. On top of that, the house was already filled with tension because of the wedding preparations. While they were sitting at dinner, stressed and mentally exhausted, Zygmunt suddenly stood up from the table. They asked him what was wrong and why he stopped eating. He replied, "This meal is missing something. I'm going out to get some potatoes." His wife told him that dinner was already served and it was too late to start cooking potatoes, but he insisted, saying, "No, I'm going to get some potatoes." It seemed like he just wanted any excuse to leave the house. Perhaps the mental pressure and tense atmosphere made him want to step outside and clear his mind. He appeared to be looking for any reason to go out. He stood up from his chair and told his wife and cousin, "I'm going to get potatoes." His cousin offered to go with him and help carry things, but Zygmunt refused, saying, No, I don't want you to come with me. I'll go alone." He took money from his wallet and left the house. The village of Tingley, where Zygmunt and his wife lived, was considered very safe. He had moved there after fleeing Poland during World War II, with his wife Lottie, seeking safety in England. In Tingley, Zygmunt found work as a coal miner. For 27 years, he worked in the mines, while his wife did not work because she suffered from multiple sclerosis, which left her living in a wheelchair. Over time, Zygmunt built many friendships and lived a stable and peaceful life in the village. The store he went to buy potatoes from was only 3 buildings away from his house. It should have taken just a few minutes to go there and return, so his wife and cousin expected him back within 10 to 15 minutes at most. But that didn't happen. More than half an hour passed, and he still hadn't returned. His wife became worried because she knew Zygmunt was not the type of person to go somewhere without telling her beforehand. If he had planned to go somewhere else, he would have told her. She asked his cousin to go check why he was late. Zygmunt had worked in coal mines for about 30 years and suffered from serious breathing problems due to his work. His wife feared that he might have become ill on the way. When the cousin reached the grocery store and asked about him, the shopkeeper confirmed that Zygmunt had indeed come, bought potatoes, and left about 25 minutes earlier. The cousin thanked the shopkeeper and walked back home, looking around the streets in case Zygmunt was sitting somewhere nearby, but he found no trace of him. When he returned, he told Lottie that that Zygmunt had bought the potatoes and left the store 25 minutes earlier. Then the cousin and his wife began asking neighbors about him. After 2 hours of searching, with no sign of him and no information about where he might have gone, they had no choice but to contact the police. The police were not very concerned at first. After all, they wouldn't launch a major investigation for someone missing for only 2 hours, especially since there were no signs of foul play. After asking questions to his wife and neighbors, police learned that Zygmunt had been under stress at work. He had requested early retirement due to breathing problems caused by coal dust, but his request had been denied. Combined with the stress of his daughter's wedding the next day, his argument with his cousin, and caring for his wheelchair-bound wife, police assumed he might have left voluntarily. They believed he hadn't really gone out to buy potatoes, but may have wanted to temporarily leave his home and family to escape the pressure. The police told his wife and cousin to wait until the next day. He might return at any time, especially since his daughter's wedding was the following day, and he loved her very much. But if he didn't appear by the time of the wedding, then something serious might have happened. The day passed, and the next day came, his daughter's wedding, but he didn't attend. After the wedding, his wife contacted the police and all the hospitals and began asking everyone in the village about him. The police, neighbors, and many people searched for him, but he had completely disappeared, leaving no trace behind. On the morning of June 11th, 5 days after Zygmunt disappeared after going to buy potatoes, a man named Trevor Parker was working at his father's large coal yard in the English town of Todmorden. The yard was a large open piece of land surrounded by iron fencing, with huge piles of coal and a small office. Before anything unusual happened, Trevor had a clear view of the entire yard. Everything looked normal, except the coal was wet due to an early morning storm. He spent some time checking the coal to make sure the storm hadn't scattered it around. After confirming everything was fine, he entered his small office and began doing some calculations. Around 3:45 p.m., he decided to go out for lunch. He got into his car and went to a nearby pub to eat. When he returned to the coal yard and drove through the gate, everything looked normal, except for something strange lying on one of the coal piles in the back of the yard. Trevor didn't know when that strange object appeared there. Was it already there when he first checked the yard, and he simply didn't notice it? Or did it appear while he was away at lunch? Either way, it caught his attention, so he got out of his car and went to investigate. The coal pile was about 4 meters high. As he got closer, he realized there was a person lying on top of it. Around that area, it wasn't uncommon for homeless drunk people to leave pubs, get intoxicated, and fall asleep in random places. Trevor assumed the person lying on the coal was one of those drunk individuals, but then he wondered, how did this drunk person climb over the iron fence and then climb a 4-meter coal pile just to sleep there? He thought to himself, how did this crazy drunk even manage to do that? Still, he went back to his small office and called an ambulance. This was considered routine in that town. Ambulances often picked up drunk individuals, took them to the hospital until they sobered up, and then released them. Because of that, when the ambulance arrived, they didn't even turn on the sirens. The paramedics stepped out of the vehicle, and Trevor pointed them toward the coal pile. As they walked, they were laughing and joking about the drunk man, since they thought it was nothing serious. One of the paramedics climbed the coal pile to check on the man. As he got closer, he noticed the man was wearing very elegant clothes, not like a homeless person at all. The man was lying face down, and his face wasn't visible. When the paramedic tried to turn him over to see his face, his expression suddenly changed. He froze in place, raised his hands in shock, and looked terrified. Trevor and the second paramedic standing below were startled by his reaction. The paramedic quickly examined the body, then hurried down the coal pile, visibly shaken, repeatedly saying, call the police quickly." Trevor asked him what he saw, but the paramedic gestured with his hand, unable to speak from shock. At that moment, Trevor himself began to feel terrified. It was clear the paramedic had seen something horrifying. They called the police, and minutes later, a police car arrived. Officer Alan Godfrey stepped out along with another officer. The frightened paramedic told them they needed to see the man on the coal pile. Officer Alan and his partner climbed up the coal pile, while Trevor and the two paramedics stayed below. Alan reached the top first. He saw the man wearing a very elegant 3-piece suit, but something strange caught his attention. The suit wasn't very dirty with coal dust. When Alan climbed the coal pile, his own clothes became covered with black coal dust. but the man lying there had a clean upper part of his suit, as if someone had placed him there instead of him climbing up himself. Another strange detail was the man's hair. It looked uneven and messy, as if it had been cut by an animal groomer. Some strands were long, others short. One side was higher than the other. There were even patches on his head with no hair at all, as if someone had grabbed his hair and cut it randomly with scissors. Then Alan noticed something even stranger. At the back of the man's neck, right near the spine, there was a deep wound that was still bleeding. Around the wound was a strange green substance, sticky, jelly-like, clearly applied directly to the injury. No one knew what that substance was. This explained why the paramedic had panicked and couldn't speak. Officer Allen grabbed the man by the shoulder to wake him. As he turned him onto his back and saw his face, he reacted exactly like the paramedic before him. He jumped back in shock, raising his hands as if he had seen a ghost. The man's face was frozen in extreme terror. His lower jaw was wide open, as if dislocated. His teeth were exposed. His eyes were bulging and wide open. At that moment, Alan realized this was not a drunk or unconscious homeless man. This was a dead man. And from his appearance, it was clear he had not died a natural death. His face showed he had died in a horrifying and terrifying way. Later, it was confirmed that the dead man was Zygmunt Adamski, who had gone to buy potatoes 5 days earlier and disappeared. But this only deepened the mystery. The coal yard in Todmorden was about 40 kilometers away from where Zygmunt lived. He didn't know anyone in that town. There was no reason for him to be there. Second, Zygmunt had left his house on foot. Was it possible he walked 40 kilometers just to die there? Third, the shopkeeper confirmed he bought potatoes. If Zygmunt wanted to abandon his family, he would have left directly. Buying potatoes indicated he intended to return home. Fourth, the coal yard was wide and open. Anyone standing there, even outside the fence, could clearly see everything inside. It would have been impossible for Zygmunt to enter, walk across the yard, and climb the coal pile without being noticed by truck drivers, workers, or even the homeless people who often stayed nearby. No one saw Zygmunt at all. It was as if he appeared out of nowhere on top of the coal pile. And even if he somehow sneaked into the yard without anyone noticing and climbed to the top, how were his clothes still that clean and not covered in coal dust? Even if someone had killed him and dumped him there, how did they carry his body up a 4-meter coal pile? Imagine carrying a human body up a mountain of coal. Your feet would sink constantly, you would lose balance, and you would likely fall multiple times. And if someone killed him, why would they dump the body in such an open place where everyone could see what was happening? Logically, they would dispose of the body somewhere hidden to avoid being caught easily. Another strange detail was that the elegant clothes Zygmunt was wearing were not the same clothes he had on the day he disappeared. Even stranger, he was wearing them incorrectly. For example, his shirt was inside out. The buttons were on the inside instead of the outside. His trousers were also worn backwards. The zipper and buttons, which should have been in the front, were at the back. It was as if someone else had dressed him randomly, just like the way his hair had been cut randomly. The position of the body was suspicious, so they took him to the morgue to learn more about his death. They discovered that the deep wound on his neck was not the main cause of death. Instead, the strange green gel around the wound remained unexplained and suspicious. No one knew what that sticky green substance was. It had been placed on and around the wound. They conducted dozens and dozens of tests to analyze it, but they still could not identify what the substance was. The coroner stated in his report that Zygmunt died on the same day his body was discovered. That meant, from the moment he disappeared 5 days earlier until he was found, no one knew what had happened to him or where he had been. As for the cause of death, the coroner was not certain, but he wrote that Zygmunt died from a heart attack, not from the wound on his neck. The doctor examined Zygmunt's entire body, looking for bruises or signs of struggle, but found none. The only marks were small burns around his neck, resembling chemical or acid burns. They also examined his stomach and found food inside, and his body showed no signs of dehydration. This indicated that he had been eating and drinking regularly, meaning he was in relatively good health before his death. However, no one knew what caused the heart attack, but it appeared that he had seen something extremely frightening, which triggered it. This was supported by the terrifying expression frozen on his face. In the end, the coroner gave up trying to explain the strange condition of the body and concluded in his report that the death was natural and not criminal. The case was then closed. To this day, no one knows how a man who went to a grocery store near his home disappeared and was later found 40 kilometers away in a coal yard, wearing strange clothes backwards, with clean clothing, a wound on his neck, badly cut hair, terrifying facial expression, acid-like burns, and the mysterious green sticky substance that no one has been able to identify. This case became famous worldwide. People who believe in the existence of other beings claimed that this incident was strong evidence of alien abduction. They believed that extraterrestrials abducted him after he left his home, conducted experiments on him during the 5 days he was missing, including the wound on his neck, applied the strange green substance, and when he died, they dressed him incorrectly because they didn't understand how humans wear clothes. Then they placed him on top of the coal pile, which explains why his clothes weren't fully covered in coal dust. And if you don't believe all of this, consider the mysterious green gel found on his neck, a substance that no laboratory has been able to identify for more than 40 years. Officer Alan Godfrey, who examined Zygmunt's body, later said that weeks after the discovery, he saw a strange flying object, and this was the drawing he made of the flying object he witnessed. And here, our story ends today. I hope you enjoyed it. Share your opinions in the comments about this mysterious case and how Zygmunt died. Don't forget to like and share this video with all your friends, and activate the notification bell. In 1947, a terrifying distress signal was sent from a specific location in the Indian Ocean. This signal was broadcast in all directions, to the extent that American, Dutch, and British ships detected it, along with international listening stations. As soon as the distress signal was detected, they were able to determine its location. A team was then sent to find out who needed help. When they reached the signal's location, or the scene of the incident, they uncovered one of the greatest maritime mysteries, the mystery of the SS Orang Medan. Before I tell this story, I want you to pay close attention, because many people who heard it claimed it was just a legend. However, there are details and evidence that are impossible for anyone to deny, such as the number of international ships that received the signal, the listening stations that detected the distress call, and the fact that it was not an ordinary distress signal. In addition, the U.S. Coast Guard published a document about this incident 5 years after it occurred. So, what exactly happened? Watch this video until the end to find out. In 1947, several American, Dutch, and British ships, along with international listening or receiving stations, detected a distress signal from the Indian Ocean. The distress signal was transmitted in Morse code, and the message said,
"All officers, including the captain, are dead, lying in the chart room and on the bridge. It is possible that the entire crew is dead."
After that, a small part of the signal appeared that was unclear and couldn't be translated, and at the end, 2 words appeared.
"I am dying."
A few hours after that signal, there was an American ship called Silver Star. This ship was patrolling around the Malaysian coasts, and with the help of other ships in the area, they were able to determine the location of the signal and identify the position of the ship that sent it, which was located at the end of a strait called the Strait of Malacca. This is a major shipping route between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which is why the ship was essentially drifting toward the Indian Ocean. There is an important note you should pay attention to about this area. It is the same region where Malaysia Airlines Flight 37-0 disappeared in 2014 without any trace. Anyway, the Silver Star tried to send a signal to the unknown ship to confirm whether they truly needed help. But after several failed attempts, they received no response at all. There was nothing but eerie silence on the transmitter. They concluded that they had to move and see what had happened to the ship. The situation looked suspicious. The Silver Star then sent signals to all nearby ships and international listening stations, informing them that it was heading toward the unknown vessel to assist it. The other ships that had received the distress signal were unsure whether they should go help or not. They thought the signal might be false and didn't want to make a useless trip. So the Silver Star informed them that it would take responsibility and move toward the ship that sent the distress signal. After hours of sailing, the Silver Star reached the location of the unknown ship. They saw the name written on it, SS Orang Medan. Now they knew the name of the ship. The experienced sailors aboard the Silver Star, the moment they got closer to the Orang Medan, realized it was a dead ship. There were no signs of a running engine, no electricity, no lights. It was just a dark hull drifting with the sea current. Considering the terrifying distress signal that came from the ship and the frightening appearance they were now seeing, they began to feel that something truly catastrophic had happened. As they got closer to the dead ship, the sailors' eyes focused on the bridge, the place where the captain usually stands and controls the wheel. But when they looked at the wheel, there was no captain. The wheel was abandoned, with no one controlling it. They looked across the deck, but saw no living soul. They expected to see sailors lined up on the deck, waving for help. But from the outside, the ship looked completely abandoned. So who sent the distress signal? All they saw was a dead ship swaying with the waves. The Silver Star sounded its horns, hoping the crew of the Orang Medan might still be inside and would come out. But no one appeared. They sent more signals through the radio and telegraph, but again, no one responded. After all these failed attempts to communicate with the Orang Medan crew, the captain of the Silver Star decided to send his sailors aboard to investigate themselves. As they boarded the ship, they felt deep inside that they were about to find a disaster, but they never imagined the catastrophe would be far worse than they expected. No one knows exactly how many crew members were on board the Orang Medan, but some accounts say around 100 people. The moment they stepped onto the deck, they found the entire crew dead. Even more mysterious, they were not dead in a normal way. The bodies looked extremely strange. All the corpses were lying on their backs. Each body appeared frozen, stiff, or rigid, with their hands raised upward. Expressions of terror were frozen on their faces. Their mouths were wide open. Their eyes were open and staring. It was as if, in their final moments, they were trying to defend themselves from something they were terrified of. Their faces were filled with horror, directed toward the sky, evidence that they had suffered extreme pain before death. Normally, when a human or animal dies, the body becomes relaxed, but these bodies looked like statues. Dead, hands raised, frozen in place, as if pushing away danger. It was as if someone had placed mannequins lying on their backs, with their arms raised. Even the dog on the ship was found lying on its back, dead, baring its teeth, its head pointed toward the sky, legs raised, as if the dog, along with the crew, had been facing an unknown enemy coming from above. Each body's eyes were directed toward a different point in the sky, some looking here, others looking there. All the dead on the ship were in the same position, as if they had been facing an invisible enemy in their final moments. They kept searching among the bodies until they reached the transmitter, the telegraph device that had sent the distress signal. They found the operator sitting dead in front of the transmitter, his fingers still frozen on the telegraph transmission button. The one who had sent the final message saying,
"I am dying,"
was the only person found dead while still sitting in his place. Unlike the rest of the bodies that were scattered on the ground, staring toward the sky with expressions of terror and fear. So he was likely the last person to die, the one who had sent the distress signal. They then went down to the engine room to inspect it. The engine room is usually extremely hot, like stepping into a sauna. But when they entered, the room was very cold. This was, of course, because the engine was not running. They found the bodies of the workers in the engine room, in the same position as the bodies on deck, lying on their backs, staring upward in terror, their hands raised, as if they had been facing ghosts before their deaths. The entire crew of the Orang Medan was dead. Strangely, there was absolutely no damage to the ship. There were no signs of destruction, no gunfire, and although the engine was not running, it was still intact. Despite the horrifying fate of the crew, there were no signs of assault on their bodies, no bruises, no wounds, no blood, and no external injuries. In addition, there were signs of rapid decomposition of the bodies, even though the distress signal had been sent only a few hours earlier. Even if the man at the transmitter had been the last to die, the bodies of those who died before him should not have started decomposing that quickly. The captain of the Silver Star ordered his sailors not to touch anything on the ship and to leave everything as it was. He then ordered them to tie the dead ship with a rope to his vessel and tow it to the nearest port, where police and investigators could examine what had happened. They tied the rope and began towing the ship. As soon as they started pulling it, thick smoke suddenly began rising from the Orang Medan. No one knew how the smoke started. They had just been in the engine room. The engine wasn't running, there was no electricity, and no fire burning anywhere on the ship. The few sailors that the Silver Star captain had left aboard the dead ship became terrified when they saw the smoke. They abandoned the ship, jumped into the water, and quickly swam back to their own vessel. The smoke kept increasing, and it became clear that the ship was about to explode. The captain of the Silver Star ordered his crew to quickly cut the rope and move away at full speed. That is exactly what they did. Shortly after they cut the rope and distanced themselves, the ship exploded in the water. The explosion lifted the ship above the surface before it sank into the depths of the ocean, taking with it all the bodies, secrets, and mysteries. Most people doubted this story because when they searched port records, they found no ship registered under the name SS Orang Medan. Some believed the ship was Dutch based on its name, while others suggested that Medan might refer to the city of Medan, the capital of North Sumatra in Indonesia. So the ship may have been registered under that name in Indonesian ports, which is why it had no records elsewhere. A ship without port records suggests someone didn't want anyone to know where it came from, where it was going, or what its mission was. It may have been carrying illegal cargo, possibly explosives. But regardless of what it carried, what could cause the crew to die in such a terrifying way? A German researcher studied the incident and published a report in 1953 titled "The Death Ship in the South Seas." His analysis is considered one of the closest explanations to reality. He suggested that the only thing that could cause bodies to freeze in place like statues and decompose rapidly wasn't ghosts or aliens, but toxic chemical gases. Since the ship had no official records, it might have been transporting illegal materials used in manufacturing weapons or bombs, such as nitroglycerin and potassium cyanide. He suggested the ship's journey was secret, possibly leaving port under a different name, then changing its identity at sea to SS Orang Medan, similar to criminals changing license plates. He believed the dangerous materials leaked and released toxic gases that killed the crew. As for the explosion, he theorized that when the Silver Star began towing the ship, the movement caused a barrel or crate of hazardous cargo to fall, ignite, and trigger a chain reaction. Additionally, no country ever reported losing such a ship because no nation smuggling illegal cargo would admit losing it. He also suggested seawater might have reacted with potassium cyanide, releasing deadly cyanide gas that killed the crew. The explosion, meanwhile, may have resulted from seawater reacting with nitroglycerin, causing the unusual blast. However, critics of this theory raised an important question. If toxic gas caused the deaths, why didn't the rescue crew from the Silver Star get affected? They had entered the engine room, an enclosed space with poor ventilation, and found the workers dead in the same condition as those on deck. If toxic gas had filled the engine room, its effects should have remained there. Yet the Silver Star crew who entered were not affected at all. Moreover, cyanide gas does not kill people that quickly. If someone died from cyanide poisoning, their body wouldn't become frozen like that, nor would it show signs of rapid decomposition. Cyanide simply doesn't cause those effects. So, what could have caused this? There is a chemical compound called tabun, a type of nerve gas that Germany developed during World War II. In fact, Germany was among the first to pioneer nerve agents. After Germany's defeat in World War II, large quantities of tabun gas remained. Anyone who inhales this gas dies quickly and experiences severe muscle spasms, similar to the condition in which the crew of the ship was found. This happens because the gas blocks neurotransmitters responsible for sending signals that allow muscles to relax, causing intense muscle contractions. Afterward, the gas evaporates quickly and leaves no trace, which explains why the crew of the Silver Star did not smell anything when they boarded the Orang Medan. After Germany's defeat, the United States wanted to obtain this gas before any other country could. Through intelligence agents, containers of the gas were allegedly loaded onto the ship. However, an inexperienced sailor may have mishandled the cargo, causing a leak that led to their deaths and prompted the distress signal. This theory also suggests that the American ship Silver Star may have been involved, possibly monitoring the Orang Medan from a distance. When the distress signal was broadcast to nearby ships and receiving stations, Silver Star reportedly informed British and Dutch ships that they would handle the rescue themselves, preventing others from boarding and discovering the cargo. According to this theory, once Silver Star discovered the catastrophe, they destroyed the ship and sank it, then fabricated the story to cover up the scandal. Another theory suggests the ship was part of a secret chemical weapon experiment. The crew may not have known what cargo they were carrying and were unknowingly used as test subjects, like lab rats. Conducting the experiment in the middle of the ocean would ensure no one else was harmed. Supporting this idea is the fact that the incident was not officially announced until 5 years later, when the U.S. Coast Guard revealed it in May 1952. This raises the question, why keep it secret for 5 years? Whatever the truth behind this ghost ship mystery, it remains one of the most fascinating unsolved maritime stories in the world. The story even inspired a famous video game released on August 30th, 2019, called Man of Medan. Since oceans cover most of Earth's surface, and humanity has explored only about 5% of them, it's not surprising that they remain full of mysteries. Abandoned ships, ghost vessels, and planes disappearing without explanation could be caused by criminal acts, natural disasters, accidents, or even supernatural phenomena. In the afternoon of September 1951, a 53-year-old man named Adolf Stiller carried a large cardboard box from his car into a boarding house for young working women in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He walked slowly down the narrow hallway until he reached the room where his 2 daughters, Bobby and Betty, both 21 years old, were unpacking their suitcases and arranging their belongings. The twins were glowing with excitement. This was their first real step into independence. For the first time in their lives, they were leaving the family home they had grown up in, a small house about an hour away, and starting a life of their own. They had decided to move here together, get jobs at a local cigarette factory, live in the boarding house, and build their future side by side. To them, it felt like crossing the threshold into adulthood. But for their father, the emotions were complicated. He was proud of them, proud that they had grown into young women capable of standing on their own feet. Yet at the same time, there was an ache in his chest. His little girls were no longer children. They were beginning lives that no longer revolved around him. Still, there was one comforting thought. Even though they had left home, they were not truly alone. They shared the same room, worked at the same factory, and had each other. And Adolf knew that even if he and their mother weren't there every day, the girls would always look after one another. Because Bobby and Betty weren't just close sisters, they were identical twins, and their bond went far beyond what most people considered normal, even for twins. They stood the exact same height, about 5'3", with round faces and dark hair styled deliberately the same way. But the similarities didn't stop at appearance. Their personalities, hobbies, and preferences mirrored each other so perfectly that some people wondered if it was intentional. Both were outgoing and warm. They played piano, sang in the school choir, and earned good grades. Yet there was something unusual about them, something harder to explain. They often became sick at the same time, even with illnesses that weren't contagious. Once, Bobby developed a painful dental abscess that left her bedridden. Not long after, Betty suffered an almost identical infection in nearly the same tooth, without any clear medical explanation. Whenever life forced differences between them, they seemed determined to erase those differences. When Bobby had to start wearing glasses due to poor eyesight, Betty insisted on getting glasses too, despite having perfectly good vision, simply so they would continue to look alike. Even moving out of their parents' home had to happen identically. Same job, same factory, same room. Deep down, Adolf and his wife secretly hoped that, with time, the girls might learn to develop a little independence from each other. They believed it would be healthier for their future. But as Adolf set the last box on the floor and looked at his daughters, smiling in perfect synchronization, he had no idea that what lay ahead would go far beyond an unusually strong twin bond. At that moment, watching their excited faces, he felt only relief and gratitude. It made sense to him that they were taking this step together, just as they always had. Maybe, he thought, this was simply a gentle transition into adulthood. For now, they could lean on each other a little longer, until eventually each would build her own life, marry, and move forward. A few minutes later, he hugged them goodbye. "I love you girls," he said. "Call me anytime you need anything." Then he left, got into his car, and drove home. 2 years later, Adolf Stiller was setting the dinner table while his wife finished cooking in their small home in Bear Creek, North Carolina. He had just placed the final plate on the table when a knock echoed through the house. His face lit up instantly. It was the weekend, and his daughters usually came home to visit every week. He smiled to himself, certain Bobby and Betty had arrived for dinner and another family weekend together. Since the girls moved out, those visits had become precious moments for both parents. Adolf hurried to the door and opened it, but what he saw stopped him cold. Standing there was Bobby, alone. Betty wasn't with her. "Where's Betty?" he asked immediately. "Is she still in the car?" Bobby shook her head. Only then did Adolf notice the suitcases in her hands and the deep sadness written across her face. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, concern rising in his voice. She hesitated before answering. "I hate the factory job," she said quietly. "I really hate it. I quit, and I came back home. I'm going to live here again." She paused, but Betty doesn't feel the same. She wants to stay, keep working, and live there alone. For Adolf, the words were shocking. The twins had never made separate decisions before. They had always done everything together. Even when one of them disliked something, she would go along with it for the sake of her sister. The idea that one twin would leave while the others stayed behind felt completely unnatural. Still, he forced a smile. "Of course you're welcome home," he said gently. "This will always be your house. But why isn't Betty visiting this weekend? Even if she's staying there, couldn't she come spend some time with us?" Bobby simply replied, "She decided not to come." The sense of unease grew stronger for both parents, but Adolf quickly tried to ease the tension. "Come inside," he said warmly. "Let's eat, get some rest, and figure things out later. What matters is that you're home." Bobby walked in, but after a short while, she said she wasn't hungry. She carried her bags upstairs, entered her room, closed the door, and didn't come back down. From that day forward, for nearly 2 full years, Bobby lived almost entirely confined to her bedroom. She rarely left. She became emotionally withdrawn, shutting herself off from the world. She never explained why she had left the factory or what had upset her so deeply. She stopped contacting old friends and made no effort to form new relationships. The once outgoing, lively young woman transformed into a recluse. She didn't look for work. She didn't plan for the future. It was as if she had surrendered completely to remaining inside that room forever. Yet something strange happened during those 2 years. Whenever Betty came home to visit on weekends, Bobby would suddenly return to her old self. The moment Betty walked through the door, Bobby seemed to awaken from emotional paralysis, laughing again, social, energetic, completely normal. The sisters interacted as if nothing had ever changed. No resentment, no distance, no unanswered questions. But as soon as Betty left and returned to the factory, Bobby would retreat back to her room, close the door, and disappear into isolation once again. And still, Adolf and his wife held on to hope that somehow their daughters would eventually learn to live independent lives. Emily had managed to build a life for herself. She worked at a textile factory outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, living alone for the first time. On the surface, everything looked stable. She paid her rent, held a steady job, and proved she could survive independently. But back home, things were falling apart. Her twin sister was slowly collapsing without her. Their father and mother watched helplessly as Claire changed. She barely spoke, rarely left the house, and seemed emotionally hollow. Anyone who saw her could tell she had depended entirely on her sister her whole life. Richard didn't know how this story would end, but with every passing month, Claire's condition worsened. For 2 full years, the family tried everything: encouragement, routine, patience, but nothing helped. Then something strange happened. On a Friday evening, exactly 2 years after leaving home, Emily suddenly walked through the front door carrying her bags. "I quit my job," she said calmly. "I'm moving back home." The announcement shocked everyone. Strangely, Richard and Margaret felt relieved. They believed the twins would finally return to their old rhythm, the inseparable bond they had shared since childhood. Maybe Claire would recover now that her other half was back, and at first, it seemed like salvation. Claire's face lit up in a way they hadn't seen in years, but something about Emily's decision didn't sit right with Richard. Emily had loved her independence. She had seemed happy living alone. There was no clear reason for her sudden return. Still, he had no proof, only a feeling. The twins had always done everything together, even when one of them didn't truly want to. It felt as if Emily had sacrificed her future just to reunite with her sister. The parents convinced themselves this was a good sign. They were wrong. The moment Emily returned, the twins became synchronized again, but not in a healthy way. They moved into Claire's bedroom together and shut the door. For nearly 24 hours straight, they didn't come out. Instead of becoming social again, they withdrew completely from the world. They stopped looking for work. They stopped seeing friends. They stopped living normal lives. They simply stayed in that room, together, always together. They slept in the same bed every night. When they left the room, which became increasingly rare, they walked side by side so closely their shoulders touched constantly. Every movement mirrored the other. If one lifted a spoon, the other lifted hers at the exact same second. If one turned her head, the other followed instantly. It was as if each sister had become a reflection of the other. They entered the bathroom together, left together, sat together, never separated. To their parents, the attachment became deeply unsettling. Far beyond ordinary sibling closeness, it looked like extreme psychological dependency, something neither Richard nor Margaret could even name. Still, they hoped time would fix it. It didn't. Soon, the situation grew darker. The twins stopped eating. At first, it seemed harmless. Maybe they simply weren't hungry. Richard would knock on the bedroom door at dinner time. The door would open slightly. Both faces appeared in the gap at the same moment. "Dinner's ready," he would say gently. Without looking at each other, they answered in perfect unison, "We're not hungry," and the door would close. Days passed, then a week. The twins refused food entirely. Their weight dropped rapidly. Their bodies weakened. Fear replaced denial. Richard and Margaret finally understood that logic and conversation weren't reaching them anymore. Something was seriously wrong. Believing it was a mental health crisis, they took both daughters to a psychiatrist. The doctor didn't need long to reach a conclusion. Both Emily and Claire were diagnosed with schizophrenia, a severe psychiatric disorder affecting perception, behavior, and connection to reality. The diagnosis seemed to explain everything: their isolation, refusal to eat, obsessive dependence on each other, growing paranoia toward everyone else. The psychiatrist prescribed antipsychotic medication and reassured Richard that treatment could stabilize them if they followed it consistently. Their parents strictly monitored every dose, but nothing improved. In fact, things became worse. The twins spent even more time locked inside the bedroom. They barely ate at all. Their bodies grew fragile, and their behavior turned increasingly paranoid, even toward their own parents. It seemed the only person either sister could tolerate was the other. They hid from the world entirely. Richard struggled with doubt. The symptoms matched schizophrenia perfectly, yet the treatment failed. If the diagnosis was correct, why wasn't anything working? Eventually, he reached a painful conclusion. They needed stronger intervention. In early 1961, when Emily and Claire were 30 years old, Richard made the decision no parent ever wants to make. Against their will, he admitted both daughters to a psychiatric hospital. At first, the treatment seemed to work. Inside the psychiatric hospital, Emily and Claire began gaining weight again. Meals were mandatory, medications were carefully monitored, and nurses watched them around the clock. For the first time in years, the twins looked physically healthier. One important decision helped their recovery. The hospital did not separate them. They shared the same room, and psychologically, that seemed to calm them. Within weeks, doctors described their condition as stable enough for discharge. They went home, and everything collapsed again. Almost immediately, the twins locked themselves inside their bedroom. They stopped eating. They isolated themselves. Their mental state deteriorated rapidly. They were admitted back to the hospital. Once inside, they improved again. Then, they were released and relapsed again. The same cycle repeated for more than a year. Hospital to recovery, to release to collapse. Over and over. Doctors, nurses, and the parents eventually faced a terrifying question. Was schizophrenia truly the core problem? Or was the real illness the extreme psychological dependence between the twins? What once appeared to be an unbreakable sisterly bond now looked dangerously unhealthy. Emily and Claire seemed incapable of developing identities separate from each other. They weren't growing as individuals. They were emotionally frozen in place. If nothing changed, doctors feared their condition would only worsen. So, a final decision was made. a decision neither sister was allowed to influence. Forced separation. On April 11th, 1962, the twins were admitted to the hospital once again, but this time was different. For the first time in their lives, Emily and Claire were placed in completely separate wings, far enough apart that they could neither see nor hear one another. The reaction was immediate. They screamed, they cried, they begged doctors to keep them together. Hospital staff insisted it was necessary for their recovery. Hours passed. Then, shortly after 1:30 a.m., Richard was awakened by the ringing telephone. Confused, he answered. On the other end was a doctor from the hospital. His voice was shaken. He tried explaining what had happened after the twins were separated, but Richard struggled to understand. The words sounded impossible. Finally, the doctor stopped speaking for a moment, then delivered the devastating truth. Something had happened that no one predicted. Something no medical training could explain. Richard stood frozen, holding the receiver in silence. In the days that followed, doctors searched desperately for answers. Psychiatrists reviewed every record. State investigators were consulted. Eventually, even the Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved. No explanation was found. The story leaked to the press and spread across newspapers throughout the United States, quickly becoming a national mystery, an event many readers described as impossible to believe. Some began asking a frightening question. What if this wasn't purely science? What if there were human connections beyond understanding? The confirmed timeline was chilling. At 12:55 a.m., a nurse performing routine rounds entered Claire's room. She found her lying peacefully on her side in bed. Dead. No signs of struggle, no illness, no injury. 5 minutes later, around 1 a.m., a doctor checked on Emily in the opposite wing of the hospital. She too was dead, lying in bed, in the exact same position. Medical examinations revealed nothing. No poisoning, no self-harm, no violence, no detectable disease. Multiple autopsies failed to identify any cause. The official ruling read, "Cause of death, undetermined." The only theory came from one of the treating psychiatrists. He suggested the forced separation created unbearable psychological trauma. The twins' bond had been so intense, emotionally, mentally, even physically, that separation itself may have triggered a voluntary shutdown of life. As if, unable to live apart, they chose to reunite another way. The idea sounded irrational, until investigators noticed one final detail. Both bodies had been found lying strangely across their beds. A bed is rectangular. People normally sleep lengthwise, but Emily and Claire were positioned at sharp angles, almost sideways across their mattresses. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Then, someone made a disturbing observation. If the walls separating their hospital rooms were removed, their bodies would have been oriented directly toward each other, as if, in their final moments, even separated by distance, they had turned instinctively to face one another, refusing to be apart, even in death. And to this day, no scientific explanation has ever fully answered what happened that night. Over the past many years, countless archaeologists and treasure hunters have tried to solve the mystery of Oak Island, also known as the Island of Oaks. In the end, however, none of them managed to uncover any solid results or real answers. Despite the island's breathtaking natural scenery and its peaceful, almost enchanting atmosphere, its past is filled with mystery, secrets, and tragic events. The legend of the island's treasure has completely consumed the minds of many greedy seekers, some of whom even lost their lives in their desperate attempts to find it. But before we dive deeper into this story, one important question remains. Where exactly is Oak Island? Oak Island is located about 200 meters off the southern coast of Nova Scotia, near the town of Windsor in Canada. It is one of more than 360 small islands scattered across Mahone Bay. Over the years, countless excavation attempts have taken place on the island, most of them focused on one specific location, a single mysterious pit. This pit became famously known as the Money Pit, or as some would later call it, the Devil's Pit. It also goes by several other names, and it is the main focus of our story today. In the summer of 1795, a young man named Daniel McGinnis made a discovery that would change history. One day, while sitting in his parents' home, Daniel noticed strange lights glowing in the sky above the island. Curious and uneasy, he decided to investigate. He took along two of his friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, and together they headed toward the source of the mysterious lights. When they arrived, the lights had vanished. However, something else immediately caught their attention. On the ground, right where the lights had appeared, they noticed clear signs of a filled-in hole, as if the earth had once been dug up and then carefully covered again. Daniel and his friends quickly came to a conclusion. This had to be the work of pirates, and if pirates had dug this hole, then surely a treasure was hidden beneath it. At the time, stories of pirates and their hidden treasures were extremely popular, especially tales involving the infamous Captain Kidd, one of the most well-known pirates of that era. The next morning, the three young men returned, each carrying a shovel. They began removing the packed soil from the hole, digging until they reached a depth of about 3 meters. At that depth, they discovered something unexpected: wood at the bottom of the pit. The wooden structure appeared carefully arranged, and the moment they saw it, excitement overwhelmed them. They were convinced they had found the treasure. The wooden floor was made of oak planks, neatly cut and tightly fitted together with impressive precision. After removing this wooden layer, they found more soil beneath it and continued digging. 3 meters deeper, they encountered another wooden floor. Now, at a depth of 6 meters, they removed the second wooden layer, only to find more packed earth below. At this point, they realized they could go no further. Digging deeper by hand was extremely dangerous, and the pit could easily collapse and bury them alive. It's important to note that these young men were digging using only their hands and basic tools. No heavy machinery, no cranes, no modern equipment. Fearing for their lives and unable to continue, they decided to refill the pit, carefully hiding it so no outsiders would notice. They kept the discovery a secret, planning to figure out their next move later. 8 years passed before the three men finally convinced a wealthy and influential businessman to fund a professional excavation. The man agreed to hire a specialized digging company, and in the summer of 1804, the excavation officially began. The company removed the old soil and resumed digging from the exact depth where Daniel and his friends had stopped years earlier. Before long, they discovered a fourth wooden barrier, and 3 meters beneath it, yet another wooden platform. 3 meters further down, they found another one. It was incredibly strange. As the company continued digging, conditions began to change. They discovered pieces of charcoal embedded in the walls of the pit, along with coconut fibers. At the time, these materials were commonly used to protect valuable items such as treasure, jewelry, or precious metals. This discovery reignited their excitement. They were convinced they were getting closer than ever to the treasure. After a long period of digging, they uncovered a large, ancient stone engraved with mysterious symbols. Beyond the stone, however, they found nothing else. Eventually, the company was forced to stop the excavation, mainly due to the enormous costs involved. Some accounts claim the work also stopped because of a violent storm that struck the area. But when the digging stopped, a new mystery emerged: the strange inscription carved into the stone. Archaeologists were brought in to decipher the message. After careful analysis, they managed to translate it. The inscription read, "40 feet below, 2 million gold coins are buried." When the company learned the meaning of the message, their excitement returned once again. In 1805, they resumed digging with renewed determination. This time, as they went deeper, they discovered several gold coins. Their joy was overwhelming. They continued digging without rest, uncovering even more gold coins. The excavation continued around the clock, 24 hours a day. They refused to stop until they finally decided to take a short break, saying, "Let's rest for today and continue the excavation tomorrow." The very next morning, one of the workers ran toward his colleagues screaming. The pit had flooded. It was completely filled with water. The entire crew was devastated. All their hard work seemed wasted, but the company refused to give up. They brought in steam-powered pumps and began draining the water from the pit. At that time, gasoline or electric pumps didn't exist yet. Everything relied on steam engines. It didn't take long before tragedy struck. One of the workers was killed when a steam pump exploded. Even worse, the workers began to notice something disturbing. The water level wasn't going down. No matter how much they pumped, it was as if they were trying to drain the ocean itself. The pit simply would not empty. Eventually, broken and discouraged, they stopped digging. For the next 40 years, the mysterious pit remained flooded and untouched until 1845. That year, a new company formed a fresh expedition to search for the treasure. This time, they arrived with larger drilling equipment and more advanced pumps than the previous team. But after only 2 days of work, disaster struck again. One of the workers was found dead under mysterious circumstances. No one knew who killed him or why. The excavation was postponed for 4 years. In 1849, the company resumed operations. For 2 full weeks, they pumped water out of the pit around the clock. Finally, the pit was completely drained. Exhausted, they decided to take a short break and continue digging the next day. But when they returned the following morning, the pit was filled with water again, completely flooded. It was a crushing blow. After 2 straight weeks of non-stop pumping, 24 hours a day, the water had somehow returned overnight. Still, they refused to quit. This time, they tried something different, a clever new idea. They brought in a drilling device similar to an auger, a long hollow pipe with sharp teeth at its tip. The pipe was connected to a suction pump. As the drill bored deeper into the bottom of the pit, the pump sucked up mud and debris, sending the slurry into a large filtering screen. If there were any gold coins or metal pieces below, they would be caught in that screen. The drill began its descent. Soon, fragments of oak wood appeared in the filter. That meant there was yet another wooden layer beneath the pit. This pit was truly strange. As drilling continued, more wooden fragments surfaced, but this time the wood was different. It resembled the type used in coffin construction. Then something even more chilling emerged, partially decomposed human remains. They also found pieces of a gold chain, possibly worn by the body discovered below. After that, nothing else of value appeared. Technical difficulties piled up again, and excavation stopped for 2 more years. In 1851, they returned to pumping water, but once again, the water refused to drain. Eventually, the project was deemed too expensive and ultimately a failure. Still, the obsession continued. More attempts were made in 1859, then again in 1867, and one of the most notable efforts came in 1889. That year, they attempted to dig a parallel shaft beside the original pit, but toxic gases rose from the new shaft, killing 1 worker. Soon after, that shaft also flooded. Every attempt to control the water failed completely. In 1897, they lowered another drill into the pit. After extensive drilling, they recovered part of a message, but the water had dissolved most of the writing, making it unreadable. They also found a few gold coins, but not many. Over the following years, multiple companies tried their luck. Every single one failed. Then, in 1965, a company obtained official permission from the Canadian government to recover the treasure. They brought in modern pumps and managed to remove nearly 90% of the water from the pit. Only a small amount remained at the bottom. They lowered the drill again, both to remove the remaining water and to continue digging. But the drill struck a massive iron structure and could go no further. Then came the tragedies that finally ended the project. The expedition leader, a man named Robert, discovered his own son dead inside the pit. His body floated whole. Shortly afterward, 2 more workers died. Autopsies revealed they had been poisoned by toxic gases. Many more expeditions would follow, but none succeeded. Over time, scientists began to understand why the pit always refilled with water. The answer lay in the brilliance of whoever designed it. Researchers discovered a complex network of underground flood tunnels connected to the ocean. Whenever digging reached a certain depth, seawater would automatically rush in through hidden channels and flood the shaft. And whenever explorers tried to block those tunnels, new ones, deeper and more concealed, would allow water to flow in again. Whoever buried the treasure had engineered a nearly perfect trap, a booby-trapped pit with no solution. In 1989, all excavation efforts were officially halted. The government refused to issue further permits in order to protect the island's natural beauty from destruction. Yet even today, questions remain. One of the biggest mysteries is the engraved stone found in the pit. In modern times, scholars re-examined the inscription and reached a completely different interpretation. Originally, the translation claimed it revealed the location of 2 million gold coins buried 40 feet below. But a more recent translation suggests something entirely different. It reads, roughly, "People will not forget the Lord. I, the priest, will pray for all." And with that, the mystery of Oak Island remains unsolved. Some scientists interpreted this writing as being connected to the remains of the coffin that were found in the pit. They claimed that among the coffin's remains were items linked to the early Coptic religion. There were also myths and legends suggesting that the pit does not contain treasure at all, but rather the devil's lair. According to these stories, the priest inside the coffin was placed there to prevent the devil from escaping. However, there has never been any concrete evidence proving that the coffin belonged to a priest or a Coptic figure, nor any solid proof that the stone dates back to ancient Egypt. All of these claims remain nothing more than theories and speculation. The truth is that many people have died on this cursed island while searching for the treasure. Even to this day, some are still trying to uncover it, yet no one has found a definitive explanation for the mysterious pit, nor has anyone uncovered the true secret of the cursed island. Now tell us in the comments, what is your interpretation of the cursed pit story? Do you believe there is really a treasure hidden there, or not? On the night of October 17th, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's wooden cabin in a rural area of Michigan to take a short walk with her dog and smoke a cigarette. It was very late, around 1:30 a.m. The cabin was extremely isolated, deep in the forest. It was about 800 meters away from the nearest neighbor, but Ada loved that isolation. She was surrounded on all sides by forests, swamps, and wilderness. Strangely enough, this environment made her feel safer than her main home in the crowded city of Detroit. The reason for that was an incident that had happened to her a few months earlier while she was in Detroit. She had been walking down the street in broad daylight, surrounded by people, when suddenly a man attacked her without any warning. He broke her nose, caused a concussion, then ran away and disappeared. The terrifying part wasn't just the assault itself. The man didn't know her at all. He didn't rob her. There was no argument, no previous conflict, no reason for him to choose her specifically. It was as if he picked her at random, attacked her, and vanished. Unfortunately, the attacker was never caught. That incident shattered Ada psychologically. It affected her mentally and physically. Her health began to decline, and on top of that, she lost her job as an engineer. She became unemployed, depressed, and overwhelmed. During that period, her uncle called her and asked if she could stay at the family's 2-story cabin in the forest to prepare it for winter, doing some light repairs and cleaning. He also told her he would pay her for the work. Ada was genuinely happy. It meant she would have a job again, solving her unemployment problem, and she would return to a place she deeply loved. The cabin had been in the family for 75 years, and her happiest childhood memories were tied to it. She saw the offer as a lifeline, a chance to escape the city, the crowds, and the fear, and return to her safe place. She hoped she could rebuild her life there, calm down, and recover psychologically from the trauma of the Detroit attack. For an entire week, she and her boyfriend stayed at the cabin, cleaning it and fixing minor things. 2 days later, her boyfriend had to leave and return to the city because they had work to do on another apartment they were preparing together. Now, Ada was alone in the cabin, with only her dog. For her, that was normal. She loved being alone, and a place like this didn't scare her at all. On the contrary, she felt very comfortable there. But that particular night, she was anxious and unable to sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a sleeping pill to help her rest, but it didn't work. Her body felt restless, her mind was racing, and anxiety was boiling inside her. So she told herself, "I'll take a short walk with the dog. Maybe I'll calm down and be able to sleep." The roads around the cabin were narrow and winding, with no streetlights at all. The forest surrounding them was pitch black, clearly not the safest place for a midnight walk. But Ada knew the area extremely well, like the back of her hand. On top of that, she had a 9mm handgun in her pocket for protection. After walking for a short while along the dark, twisting road near the cabin, her dog stopped by a tree to relieve itself. Ada stopped, lit a cigarette, and waited. Suddenly, the dog froze. It stopped what it was doing, turned its head slightly, its ears standing straight up, and began to growl, staring intensely into a specific spot in the darkness. Ada raised her flashlight and pointed the beam toward where the dog was looking. At that moment, the cone of light revealed two glowing eyes staring back at her from the darkness. From the very first second, she knew exactly what she was looking at. It was a mountain lion. She tried to stay calm. Slowly, she slipped her hand into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before she could, the glowing eyes blinked. Then she heard movement as the mountain lion turned and ran back into the forest. She was sure it was gone. Ada let out a long, shaky breath, grabbed her dog, and hurried back toward the cabin. When she reached it, the lights were on inside. She had left them on before going out. She climbed the small wooden front steps, opened the door quickly, went inside with her dog, and locked the door behind her. She unclipped the dog's leash, then grabbed her phone and sent a message to her boyfriend, telling him about the mountain lion she had just encountered. After sending the message, she felt some relief now that she was inside, but the tension inside her was still there. Just minutes ago, she had been only a few steps away from a mountain lion, alone in the forest, in the middle of the night, with no one else around. Suddenly, she heard a sound outside the living room window. It sounded like branches snapping, or a tree limb breaking, exactly like someone walking right beside the window. The cabin was laid out like this. As soon as you entered, you were in the kitchen. Directly behind it was the living room, all in one open space. An open American-style kitchen connected to the living area. There was also a staircase leading up to the second floor. From where she stood in the kitchen, Ada had a clear view of the living room window, the source of the sound. But because the inside of the cabin was lit and the outside was completely dark, the window acted like a mirror. To see outside clearly, she would have to press her face close to the glass. Slowly, cautiously, she walked toward the window. Her heart was pounding as she leaned in and pressed her face against the glass to look outside. There was nothing there. Total darkness. No movement at all. She stepped back, and her mind began to race. Maybe it was the mountain lion. Maybe it had followed her back to the cabin. The thought was terrifying. But at least she was inside now, not outside. At the same time, she knew that mountain lions weren't known to behave like this. They don't usually stalk humans or circle houses like that. This wasn't normal behavior for them, and yet there was no other explanation, so she told herself,
"There's definitely nothing here. This place is safe. I'm just imagining things."
She pushed the thought out of her mind. She took off her jacket, placed her belongings on the table, sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the television, and tried to calm herself. After about 20 minutes, she actually began to relax. She was almost ready to turn off the TV and go upstairs to sleep. Suddenly, she heard another sound, coming from the same living room window. This time, she lifted her eyes and looked toward the window. Despite the reflection from the lights inside, she could clearly make out that someone was moving outside. This time, it was unmistakable. It was not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. She barely managed to suppress a scream. Instinctively, she grabbed the handgun that was lying on the coffee table in front of the couch. Then she jumped behind the couch and crouched down, curling into herself so whoever was outside couldn't see her. Holding the gun tightly, she raised her voice and said,
"I have a gun. If you try to come in, I'll shoot."
There was no response. She fell silent and strained her ears, listening as hard as she could, trying to catch any sound of movement. She wanted to know where he was. Was he still standing by the window, or had he moved somewhere else? All she could hear was the wind hitting the cabin from all sides and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the forest. Just as she began to question herself, did I really see someone, or was it all in my head? She heard it clearly. Footsteps on the front porch. Once again, she forced back a scream and rushed to the other side of the couch, making sure whoever was at the door couldn't see her through the window. She grabbed her phone and started dialing 911. Her finger hovered over the call button, but before pressing it, she stopped. Am I overreacting? She asked herself. Maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe it's an animal. Maybe this is all just fear, leftover fear from what happened to me in Detroit. Deep down, she knew that ever since the random attack she'd survived that summer, everything scared her. Every sound, every shadow, even the smallest movement made her heart race with terror. She didn't want to embarrass herself or be judged as crazy if the police showed up and found nothing. So instead of calling 911, she decided to call her boyfriend. She called him. The phone rang while she stayed hyper-focused on every sound outside, but he didn't answer. It was almost 2:30 a.m.